David was the first recipient of the EluNIR Young Investigator Award at TCT in 2003. He's an incredibly close friend, is the principal investigator of that extraordinary little trial that we'll talk about, Bionics. So it's a pleasure to work with David on this program.
Thank you, Marty. And again, I think there's a terrific introduction from both you and Yoram leading into the clinical application of the BioNIR program from both the Bionics and the Nereus clinical trials. As Yoram and in part Marty both described, the BioNIR stent really has 4 differentiating attributes, not only related to the stent design, which he didn't address, but has variable strut width and variable cell size that permits more uniform drug distribution. And then, of course, the drug retiferolimus, which is a novel antiproliferative agent, but unlike most other limus analogs, it has one of the highest therapeutic to toxicity margins. And then third is the stent delivery system, which too has been modified to enhance performance. Fourth is the elastomeric polymer that's more resistant, as Yoram described, to other distortions we've seen with contemporary drug-eluting stents. But the fifth one is really the manufacturing process that was introduced by Marty and Yoram that could not only confer economic advantages, not simply to the manufacturer, but to the consumer as well. And Yoram addressed this very briefly, but I will highlight it further, is that the novel antiproliferative agent, retiferolimus, is very similar to the everolimus-eluting Zion stent and the zolderolimus-eluting Endeavor Resolute stent on the left-hand panel. Elutes over 95% of its drug after implantation over a 180-day period. But in contrast to, for example, the Resolute stent in the right-hand panel, the BioNIR stent has a much more stable drug distribution and a lower drug dose concentration that is maintained throughout and persistent throughout the period of drug elution. So there are no peaks and troughs, there are no active drug bursts or variability that are dependent on diffusion constants for drug to diffuse evenly throughout the vessel architecture to be effective. And the findings of the Bionics trial that we just presented this weekend as a late-breaking study fall against the background of a simultaneously initiated trial termed Nereus. And Nereus was performed in Europe and in Israel. It randomized 302 patients in a 2-to-1 fashion to the BioNIR stent versus the Resolute stent to evaluate the primary non-inferiority designed endpoint of angiographic in-stent late lumen loss. And the trial certainly achieved its primary endpoint, demonstrating favorably low late loss values for the BioNIR stent, 0.042 millimeters, similar to that of the Resolute stent, and against the background of favorably low adverse events through 6 months follow-up. I will share with you too that while the Nereus trial and the Bionics trial that I'll soon describe were key pivotal registration trials for their respective geographies, and they were started simultaneously, essentially within the same week of enrollment, they were started with no predicate first-in-human feasibility experience with a retiferolimus-eluting stent. So these were very ambitious programs in which the first-in-human patients also served towards the pivotal trial. It was a very unique and ambitious clinical project. With regard to other secondary angiographic outcomes, again, late loss, both in segment and as previously shown in stent, was very low. Binary restenosis was exceptionally low and similar to the Resolute stent as well. And Peter Smits, the principal investigator of this program from the Netherlands, presented just yesterday morning the 12-month clinical outcomes of this study, notwithstanding the smaller sample size, demonstrating favorably low adverse events, a target lesion revascularization rate through 1 year of less than 2.4% for TLR, and a 0.5% incidence of stent thrombosis, and altogether collectively a 3.4% incidence of target lesion failure at 12 months follow-up. And this led us then to embark on, in parallel to the Bionics trial. And Bionics randomized 1,919 patients at 76 centers in North America, Europe, and in Israel. The patients evenly randomized to the BioNIR stent or the Resolute stent to evaluate the 12-month outcome of target lesion failure. A subgroup of patients, approximately 100 patients in each stent cohort, are presently undergoing both IVUS and angiographic follow-up. And the study was, unlike other key pivotal registration trials for drug-eluting stents, quite different in the sense that it enrolled a broader, less selected patient population, a so-termed more-comers patient population, patients that were included that had complex lesion characteristics such as chronic total occlusion, saphenous vein graft disease, bifurcations, lesions that required atherectomy, osteal lesions, among others, as well as complex patient indications, patients with non-ST elevation myocardial infarction, patients with recent ST elevation myocardial infarction, and patients requiring multi-vessel disease treatment. And as I shared with you, the patients were enrolled in 8 countries, approximately 45% of the study population, both in the United States and Canada, representing North America. And the enrollment occurred over a fairly rapid timeline for nearly 2,000 patients. Enrollment began in March of 2014 and was completed at the end of August 2015. Overall, 4,206 patients had provided informed consent to participate in the Bionics trial. As I shared with you, by intention to treat analysis, this led to 1,919 patients that were evenly randomized to BioNIR versus the Resolute stent. And the study that was led by the Cardiovascular Research Foundation for academic oversight was exceptional here. Completeness of follow-up was more than 98%. And as I also shared, there's a subgroup of patients presently undergoing angiographic follow-up. I'd have to say that the academic oversight, too, was quite exceptional for this study because we just received these results that I'm sharing with you within the past 2.5 to 3 weeks. And it's been an amazing collective effort among many people, in part at CRF2, Dr. Ori Ben Yehuda, to make these results available to us. Overall, there were no statistically significant differences in baseline characteristics in the trial, although angiographic characteristics were also similar. It's notable that 1/3 of the patient population was diabetic. Further, 35% of the patients involved in this trial had elevated baseline biomarkers, so a high-risk cohort of patients. And finally, there was one significant difference with a higher incidence of severe calcification in patients treated with the BioNIR stent. And when we look at procedural success, it was quite high, more than 97% for both stent cohorts in this trial. There was a very modest but statistically significant difference because it's based on a lesion basis analysis in device success between the 2 stents, but overall favorable procedural outcomes, very favorable 30-day outcomes not represented here. And with regard to the 12-month primary endpoint of target lesion failure, this study, which was designed as a non-inferiority trial, had numerically identical event rates for target lesion failure of 5.3% for BioNIR, 5.3% for the Resolute stent, and with the upper confidence boundary of 1.8%, it well met the pre-specified non-inferiority margin, thus meeting its primary endpoint with a non-inferiority p-value of 0.0012. Further, with regard to individual component elements of target lesion failure, through 12 months of follow-up, cardiovascular-related death was exceptionally low, 0.5 and 0.2% for BioNIR and Resolute respectively. Target vessel-related myocardial infarction also favorably low, 3.1% for BioNIR, 3.3% for Resolute. And in the context of a fairly broad, complex patient population, ischemia-driven target lesion revascularization rates that are also quite favorable, 3% for BioNIR, 2.4% for Resolute. So the trajectory in DES trials is that patients are getting more complicated, but the outcomes seemingly are getting even better. And further, in that same theme, outcomes of stent thrombosis were also quite favorable. Definite probable stent thrombosis through 1 year, 0.4% for the BioNIR stent, 0.6% for the Resolute drug-eluting stent. And for the BioNIR stent, there were no probable stent thrombosis events, and there were no events of stent thrombosis after the first 30 days. And through 12 months of follow-up, there were 3 events in the Resolute cohort occurring late, that is. And finally, with regard to subgroups of pre-specified interest relative to the presence or absence of diabetes, presentation of acute coronary syndromes, sex, region of enrollment, or patient age, overall there were no statistically significant differences observed between the 2 stent types that would favor treatment with one stent type versus another. So in summary, the Nereus trial, which has completed its primary endpoint and now with 12-month outcomes represented just yesterday here at TCT, demonstrated very low 6-month angiographic instant late loss, and again, quite favorably low adverse events with target lesion revascularization of less than 3% through 12-month follow-up. With regard to the Bionics trial, the EluNIR stent, as demonstrated, was statistically non-inferior to the Resolute stent for 1-year clinical outcome of target lesion failure. Indeed, the target lesion failure rate was identical at 5.3%. There was a very low stent thrombosis rate and a low rate of target lesion revascularization of only 3% that is consistent with the angiographic outcomes we've observed in the Nereus experience, and 13-month angiographic follow-up is ongoing, and we are hopeful for presentation early next spring. Altogether, as I shared with you, these were 2 ambitious drug-eluting stent programs performed in multiple geographies by various institutions that combined a first-in-human experience with pivotal registration trials. And altogether, these findings do support the safety and efficacy of the retiferolimus-eluting EluNIR stent in a trial population that was quite representative of those we encounter in real-world clinical practice. Thank you.